Presentation of the preliminary fiscal year 2021 budget.
I'll take that as a compliment of the exciting subject material.
Tom is sitting on the edge of his chair.
This is the best seat. This is the closest one.
Right?
Thank you, Dottie. On Friday, I forwarded the preliminary fiscal 2021 budget, the summary of that, and then today the line item detailed to the board. Hopefully that was helpful. Normally, just because of a time crunch we're working with, I don't give a document to you folks until the night I'm presenting it. And so here we are. I'm happy to be presenting this to you this evening. Planning for a given fiscal year really kicks off in earnest the fall, the year prior, when all departments are directed to submit preliminary budget requests for my review. During the winter, the finance director and I meet with all of those department heads, and we review and refine their initial requests. We take a look at if typically, particularly in our given revenue environment, things are level service requests, but if anything jumps out, what's different about the coming year? Is that necessary? We try to check those assumptions, and our departments run really tight ships here, so it's usually a pretty professional and straightforward process. We do that through the winter. We refine that and incorporate it into our most current revenue projections that we have available at that time. And typically we bring a preliminary budget presentation to the board in February. The charter in Easton requires that it's done by March. We try to stay about a month ahead of that. Then we spend the rest of the spring, really, and that's what I have lined up here, working to refine that preliminary budget with lots of public review and input. Through March and April, typically balancing the budget towards the end of April so that it can be delivered to town meeting and adopted on the third Monday in May. So we're kind of at the top of that chart, and we're going to keep working through that over the next many months. So fiscal 21 is going to sound and feel a lot like a lot of the prior budgets, especially the ones I've given, because the fundamentals underpinning our financial condition are largely unchanged. So it will be, and at the risk of sounding repetitive, it'll be a tough year to balance a budget like it is every year. The structural revenue deficit that was born out of the last recession persists. This will be our 13th budget consecutively that we are meeting our charge of balancing a budget in spite of revenue that does not grow to meet our expense needs. That revenue deficit persists. It will continue to constrain our ability increasingly just to keep services level. I think Dave Field's presentation on roads is a good segue to this. That's a manifestation of what we're going to talk about tonight. Certain historically positive growth revenues, such as local receipts, have slowed down a little bit. That's something that we anticipated and have been forecasting. Net state aid last year was actually cut. It's something you don't usually say, you never want to say, particularly in a growth economy, but so last year, as the board probably remembers fairly well, we had a particularly difficult year last year, much harder than many recent years, because state aid, rather than just growing slowly, was actually cut by almost $250,000 in the net. Unfortunately, the preliminary budget for the Commonwealth proposes only a minimal increase from that cut, which would still keep us below where we were in 2019. So the increases that we're looking at right now, going into next year, still don't even make up for what was cut this year. Unsurprisingly, department budget requests, they were instructed to only produce budgets that were level service, that any increases be tied to contractual and legal requirements. And the growth in expenses is not being driven by programmatic improvements, not being driven by fixing more roads, not being driven by doing more with a talented staff that we've had quite a few of in here tonight. It's just with fixed costs, leaving fewer and fewer dollars to do any of those more exciting things. I was mindful of this narrative while writing it, that I don't want to only focus on the challenges we have. because I could stay here all night doing that. I think it's really important to be mindful that there's been a lot of successes here to try to mitigate these challenges in some pretty meaningful ways. And so we will be going into and continuing to benefit from the third year in fiscal 21 of the current round of collective bargaining agreements that were, on the whole, very conservative. We are continuing to benefit from legacy savings achieved by the town joining the Group Insurance Commission for insurance for our employees. New growth is between 18, 19, and 20. The 3 prior years are at record high levels that we have not seen since before the global financial crisis. I think that's a definite bright spot, and I'll get into some more detail there. On the reserve front, the proposed use of reserves in this coming budget will be the least reserve dollars that we've used, the fewest, I think it's the grammatically proper term there, since 2009. And our stabilization fund is at the highest it's been in at least 20 years. So there are some real noteworthy and important positive things going on. So in summary, when you look at the big picture, the preliminary revenue projection for fiscal 21 at this time totals $89,415,000, which is an increase of just under 3% over the current year. Our projected expenses for fiscal 21 total just over $90,500,000, which is an increase of 4.19%. That yields a preliminary budget deficit of $1.1 million. This is familiar territory for us due to the structural revenue deficit we have. However, context is important. At this time last year, we were looking at a projected deficit of about $1.9 million. So that's not to marginalize it. This will present challenges, but it is a better starting position than where we were 12 months ago. The layout of these budget presentations is, for better or for worse, always the same. Revenue first and then expenditures, because our ability to spend funds and program services is predicated on our revenues, which are largely constrained by law on how we raise them. So cities and towns in Massachusetts, including Easton, are limited in their ability to increase a property tax levy, which is the total amount of tax we collect in a year, to 2.5% plus new growth in a given year. The town has and is going to continue to levy taxes to the extent that's allowed by Prop 2.5. And we've been working really, really hard to promote new growth to shore up that tax base over the years. Beyond taxation, Easton obtains revenue from local receipts, state aid, and a combination of other funding sources. So again, total revenue, we're looking at a projected increase of just shy of 3% for next year. The preliminary budget is projecting an increase in total tax revenue of just over 4%, which is about $2.39 million, $379 million, for a total tax collection of $61,215,696. As time passes, our reliance on taxation as a proportional source of revenue increases, which adds really already a really important area for us to work on as new growth. Really makes it significantly more premium that we focus on it, because that's one of the only areas that we really have much influence in that regard. So the table you see up there shows if you move from left to right, starting in 18, 19, 20 to 21, you can see quite clearly, both in the raw numbers, but the bottom line is really the most informative, that in 2018, taxes composed 70.5% of our revenue, and next year we're looking at 73.5%. And that's going to continue. So because taxes are the largest portion of our revenue, which has always been the case, and that necessarily makes them the most meaningful, the revenue source that we are most reliant on. And so that makes new growth critical. So Prop 2.5 is 2.5% plus new growth. So new growth, simply put, is the value of any new or significantly improved property subject to taxation. Expansion of infrastructure, adoption of improved zoning, implementing streamlined permitting processes and software, all of those things promote new growth. And I thought this year we should start including in these budgets conversations of some real concrete examples of this. And so on the screen you have a handful. The calendar years are noted, but this came up in the housing conversation as well, because all of these things with good planning intermingle. Housing planning is in a silo separate from economic development planning, separate from financial planning. These things all work together, and we've tried to be quite successful with it. Queeset Commercial District, obviously we have the 40R there. We have the zoning overlay that was adopted in 2015 to help people do more with their existing property. We purchased the necessary sewer treatment capacity from Doug King. Did a Mass Works funded roadway improvement project as part of that 40R. The Economic Development Council rolled out a site locator tool for folks who may be looking to develop in Easton to use Easton's existing GIS database and tools to find property that is for sale and have easy access to zoning maps and other really important stuff that folks need to have access to make good decisions about development. It was actually featured by the Mass Municipal Association as a best practice for promoting development on the statewide level. Obviously, invested millions of dollars in the Route 138 area to construct the Queeset Sewer, which just wrapped up last summer. And you're seeing some of that start to come to fruition already with the planning board's approval of the mixed-use redevelopment of Korea's Plaza that folks were at the groundbreaking for last fall. Five Corners has a lot of similarities. The board executed a LIP with Avalon that resulted in significant new growth worth more than $625,000, brought in more than $6 million in mitigation for not only the Five Corners sewer, but also, to Wayne's point, funded the feasibility portion of the now approved Easton Early Elementary School project. Those are critical projects for the town. Town meeting adopted the Compact Neighborhood Overlay District in that neck of the woods that will take advantage of sewer. That'll be DIF eligible growth. That project will be going to a joint hearing of a planning committee, planning and zoning board and the Conservation Commission February 18th to get through the permitting process and hopefully start construction this year. The community came together and adopted the DIF to help support the financing of the Five Corners sewer, which is the largest capital project, non-building project we've ever done. There was an amendment to that LIP with Avalon last summer for additional new growth, additional units of housing to get us back into safe harbor, and additional mitigation to help support that sewer construction. Received a $1.5 million grant for the sewer construction there from Mass Works, and obviously the construction is ongoing. So we're working, I think, quite hard across all of our departments, across our boards, to try to shore this area up. And I think that the dividends of that effort are beginning to show. Obviously, the town can't take credit for all of it. There's been a significant economic recovery coming out of that recession as well, particularly recently. So between the regional and national economy doing well, between those major investments on the town part, new growth hit record levels in Easton in 2018, 19, and 20. We haven't seen levels like that since before the global financial crisis in 2008. So over $1 million in 18, about $865,000 in 19, and we certified at about $950,000 in 20. So you're looking at a 3-year average of about $933,000 in new growth. If you took the prior 10 years before this current window, you're looking at 654. So that's a 43% increase in our new growth since where we were coming from. Again, I am certainly absolutely not taking personal credit for that. And I'm not even attributing it solely to the town's efforts, but that is a part of a bigger picture that's very important, that really speaks truth to how important it is that we do work on all these kind of comprehensive plans, that we do things like Envision Easton, and that we try to work with people to get good projects moving, because this is, new growth is the only place where the town can increase the tax levy outside of an override.
Right now, but one of the things too that I think is worth thinking about, that's not going to happen anytime very soon, but as we're looking to increase economic development, when a town reaches about 20% or a little bit more of their commercial, they can look at changing a split tax rate. And then if you get to that point, that can certainly help too. It has, a lot of thought has to be put into it. But that's also a strategic way to look at new opportunities for revenue.
Sure. For budgeting purposes, as is typical at this point of the year, we're projecting a more conservative figure right now, $700,000 for fiscal 21. Again, for one reason, it's just based on where we are in the budgeting process. We'll take a closer look at building permit activity to adjust that if need be. And it's also based on the current timeline for permitting. So in order for growth to hit in a certain year, it needs to be completed and assessed. So just based on where things are in the pipeline, we're taking a little bit more of a conservative look for now. We'll take a look at that as spring rolls forward. So taxation is our largest source of revenue. The second largest source of revenue for the town is state aid. It is also the town's most significant and persistent revenue challenge. State aid was cut in fiscal year 2008, and it did not recover until 2016. 17, 18, and 19 saw reliable, if modest, increases to state aid in Easton, which you can see more towards that right-hand portion of the graph on the screen. Unfortunately, in the current fiscal year we're in, fiscal 20, the net state aid to Easton, which is state aid minus the assessments that we pay for things like charter schools, was cut by $232,000, which was almost a 2% cut. The preliminary Town of Easton budget for fiscal 21 is built off of the assumptions from the governor's fiscal 21 budget for the Commonwealth, and that has a 1.26% increase to state revenue. So unfortunately, from where we sit now, net state aid for fiscal 21 is still not even going to be where we were at in 2019. Framed more simply, we've lost ground. And you can see that on the graph, the very obvious dip and the dotted red line is what we're projecting based on the governor's proposal. So even assuming we're in an environment where costs did not escalate, which isn't really a thing anywhere, but even assuming that were the case, we still would be behind. Mm-hmm. So not only are we behind in real dollars from 2019 based on this, that doesn't take into account the cost of labor, of supplies and goods, of inflation, anything like that. So we're this really, really takes a situation that's already challenging and kind of ups the ante for us budget officials. So state aid used to compose about 23% of our total revenue before the global financial crisis, and we're looking at less than 16% next year. So it's basically the exact opposite effect, and those things are obviously related. From the taxation table that I showed, where taxes necessarily are composing a ever-growing part of our revenue, that is in part because state aid is stagnating and composing less and less and less. The recently adopted Student Opportunity Act got quite a bit of press coverage, for good reason. It does make a lot of meaningful improvements to education in Massachusetts. So this is not a slight at that whatsoever, but Easton is a minimum aid community, and without getting into a level of detail that I'm not qualified to even attempt to explain anyway, what that really means for us is that we get a minimum increase in Chapter 70 education aid every year that is basically $30 per student. So in Easton's case, we're looking at about a $100,000 increase to a line item worth more than $10 million. Mm-hmm. And that is not going to change. So the reform has come, it is here, and our situation remains unchanged. So we can expect this to continue. As state aid continues to shrink as a portion of our annual revenue, those losses obviously have to be offset somewhere. We don't deficit spend on the local level. So those can only be offset through taxation, which we're doing everything we can to promote that through new growth. The use of reserves, which we are trying to stop doing at the level that we have done in the past, or through expense reductions and service cuts.
I think it's worth noting, we've talked about this before, but just to get on record in this presentation, that we did go in and meet with
Senator Lewis.
If you want to just give
Sure, yeah, the chair of the Education Reform Committee. It's a very good point, Dottie. It's in my written memo, but I didn't include it here. We have and we enjoy the benefits of a good relationship with our delegation. And part of that is that we routinely, members of this board, myself, the school committee, superintendent, routinely lobby and meet with lawmakers to try to explain the circumstances of Easton, advocate for additional funding. We obviously understand they have their own budgets to balance. And that included last fall meeting with Senator Lewis and Senator Timilty to discuss with the Education Reform Committee the needs that the town has. And I believe in the Senate and also in the House that our reps did well by us and did try to fight for Easton. They tried to amend, they've tried to file amendments to the act to move Easton into a different labor market for what's called a growth adjustment factor, I believe, or a wage adjustment factor, which is one of the many variables in how they calculate how much aid you should receive. So both Senator Timilty as well as Representative Cronin attempted to get that attached to the bill, but both of those amendments were defeated. So we remain in the labor market we are in. So this is.
And they said that they're going to try to do that again this year.
Yes.
You know, they understand, they meet with us often. So when we talk about state aid, net state aid decreasing, it's certainly not for lack of efforts on our legislative delegation. And
Correct.
you know, we do appreciate and enjoy that relationship where we can talk with them about things. Well, what are some other ways that we can, you know, try to make changes, and trying to get this amendment in is one of those ways.
Right.
Those are very important points. Thank you. My intent here was not to malign certainly individual lawmakers' efforts. So we are doing everything we can to keep working with them on that. Local receipts, third largest revenue category. As the board may recall, in the past few years, Wendy and I have made it a point to highlight local receipts, both as a bright spot in our revenue picture, but also to make clear that the level of growth we were seeing over 5%, 6%, 7% in some years was not something that we thought was going to sustain each and every single year. And we did see some actual decline between 17 and 18 based on building permits that do not reoccur. You don't have Avalon scale projects every year. We are always conservative this early in the revenue forecasting game, and we do that to take care to be conservative in that approach, because conservative revenue estimates are important for expectation setting and for making sure that we don't over obligate our expenditure capacity. It's also important for continuing to generate free cash, which is required not only for our structural revenue shortfall in the operating budget, but we also use that for capital investments. So right now we're going with a modest across-the-board estimate of 1.5% for those local receipts. Kind of skipped over explaining local receipts are vehicle excise tax, ambulance fees, local meals taxes, things like that. So when folks move into town and are paying a property tax bill, that's wonderful, but they also usually bring cars, so that's nice as well. That pays excise tax to the community. They patronize restaurants in Easton, which gets a local meals tax, so those dollars are all very, very important to delivering service. So again, right now we're looking at a modest increase of 1.5% there, and we'll keep an eye on that as actuals come through as the season moves on. This gets to the last major revenue category, which is reserves and other financing sources. I'm going to really focus on reserves because that's the most significant part of it. So since the onset of the global financial crisis, the cuts to state aid and the stagnation and growth there, the town has been relying on reserve funds, which is a mix of free cash and stabilization funds, to close that revenue deficit at a rate that became unsustainable. 4 years ago, the Select Board adopted a series of financial management guidelines intended to limit that practice, understanding that it's far easier said than done, hence kind of guidelines rather than rigidity of policy. And the main important features there was that no more than half of our free cash would be used in the operating budget in the following year, that a minimum of a quarter of that would be transferred to the Stabilization Fund, and that we try to limit the use of stabilization dollars for rare or extenuating circumstances, unforeseen expenditures, legal settlements, things of that nature. So this slide captures what that structural revenue deficit looks like. I hope this is a little more legible. The one I was using before was kind of mountainous, and somebody, after me using it for 3 years, kind of matter-of-factly said, oh yeah, no one understands that graph. So I hope this is a little bit better. In red, you see free cash. So it's basically excess funds that were either unspent or collected over what we anticipated. And blue is general stabilization fund use. And all the way on the left is fiscal 2007. That was right when the last general override was passed in Easton. It's a rarity in this community. And it is unsurprising that in a year when local revenue growth was large, and state revenue was still growing, that the reliance on reserve money was effectively non-existent. The immediate year right after, still largely non-existent. But in fiscal 9, following the financial meltdown, the state began cutting revenue to cities and towns, and you see the beginning of a trend that started in 2009 and has never ended, of using up to and over $2 million in a given year of reserve funds just to balance the budget. This is not reflective of wild spending and massive staff ups and huge capital plans. This is really basically reflective of additional reserve support needed to keep services mostly level, which is unfortunate. However, the good news is that since the adoption of those policies, you look, 2016 was a peak year for reserve use. The board adopted those policies, and we've cut reserve use in half in a very short amount of time. And that is not without pain. Obviously, in a kind of purely financial worldview, it's great, but that means that if we're using 1 million, which is roughly what we're using this year, compared to 4 years ago using 2, that's $1 million of revenue that's off the table.
What could we do with $1 million?
For perspective, the entire budget for every town hall department is about 2.4. Or if we recall, Dave Field just gave a presentation where we have about $500,000 a year to work with on our roads, and if we want to start doing what we know DPW could do and giving them the resources to not only keep the roads where they are, but really start chipping away at that backlog, you need to add $1 million to it. So we've cut the equivalent of that out of our operating budget deliberately and not without pain in a really compressed window of time. And that is because those policies were adopted, and in 19, 20, and 21, we are proposing adhering strictly to them. And if that is the case, 2021 fiscal year is projecting $909,000 in free cash. That's half of what's available from last year. It's going to be the lowest use of reserves and the first time since 2009 that we've used less than $1 million of reserve funds in the operating budget.
That's incredible progress in a really short amount of time.
It is, and again, not without challenges. It is, in one sense, indisputably the right thing to do, because, and we had a lot of good conversations about this in the spring when folks were looking at the fact that we still had a gap to close leading into April, and people were understandably disappointed to see that there was so many challenges, especially for larger budgets, especially for the school. And folks asked legitimate questions of, stabilization fund's doing well, why don't we just take $500,000 out of there? And the answer is that you're propping up a spending level that has no plan next year. And what if you have another cut that you weren't anticipating? All you're doing is you're kind of putting it higher so that when there is a market correction or a significant recession and revenue stagnates or drops, it will just make it significantly worse. So we're trying to do the right thing today, even though it's somewhat painful, so that we're not in a weakened position tomorrow and for the eventual recession. You know, economies do.
Our spending has to be sustainable.
Correct.
If we want to hire somebody, we need to know that there's a way to support that person.
Correct, within the budgets that we have. And so we frequently have positions, we try to maintain the service level we have. There are significant unfunded needs, and we'll get into that a little bit later, that we just simply don't fund, and which we will now be adding to that list, road work. So at the same time as trying to cut our use of these reserves in the budget, we've also been trying to build our stabilization fund. So free cash is kind of like excess money left over in your checking account. Stabilization fund is your savings. And so since 2016, as I said, we cut the use of reserves and of general reserve dollars in our budget in half, and we've doubled the size of our stabilization fund. It was at 1.56 million. It's now over 3.25, and that's the highest it's been in at least 20 years. We stopped looking farther back.
From a dollar perspective.
From a dollar perspective.
Not necessarily from a percentage of your budget.
That's a good point. From a percentage of our budget, we are at least in the best position since 2009, which is that we're near about 6% of a funded ratio. So what we're talking about here is that our collective free cash and stabilization funds right now are roughly equivalent to 6% of our annual operating expenditure level. We set as a policy, our fund balance policy, between 7 and 10% as the goal of where you want to be. And then anything under 7 is cause for concern. So we've made very significant progress in real dollars, but also as a percent, but we're still not fully there.
And there's no surprise that it's a correlation between your last slide, which showed us utilizing less free cash and no stabilization funds, and going down, and the upward trend of our ability to increase our stabilization dollars.
Well,
right?
Yeah, that makes sense, right? You're spending less and you're putting more in the bank.
Exactly. So, and I think that speaks to what you said earlier about the fact that we're trying to build up this fund, this stabilization fund. If you notice, like to your point, back in 09 and 08, when we had a height of 3 million, how far it dropped.
And how quickly.
And how quickly.
And that was
right?
with layoffs.
Right.
So, yes, and that's really, and it followed an override.
Yep.
So think about all of the cards on the table that were in the town's favor from a revenue and financial position standpoint before the last recession. And even with all of those things, granted, it was the worst recession in a generation. And hopefully none of us will be in a situation where we have that on our watch, but we need to be prepared. And even with all of those things in the town's favor, we spent our stabilization account down to, I think, about $700,000 in the course of 2 years with layoffs.
Just scary.
Yeah. So it really, and I'm not attempting to fearmonger, that actually almost perfectly mirrors the state revenue graph. And that's not an accident either. This is a new slide. We felt it was good to also include, for discussion purposes, that the revenue deficit challenges us in a lot of different ways. It's not just on our revenue coming in, especially when you couple it with trying to be more prudent about what you're doing on a reserve front, and you're using half of that free cash in the operating budget, and then a quarter is going into the bank. That leaves you with a quarter of your free cash for capital, which is not sufficient.
Just not enough.
It's not enough. And at the same time, you have a dynamic where we are forced to not only increasingly sharpen our pencils from kind of a programmatic standpoint, where we get smarter and smarter about reorganizing departments and finding economic efficiencies and regionalizing services and all these exciting and good things to be doing to save spending, we also need to continue to sharpen our pencil on our revenue and expense estimates, and things get closer and closer. You have a diminishing margin to work in. Anyone who works in budgeting would tell you that. So we have a shrinking margin for error every year, and that manifests predictably with free cash certifications beginning to decline. And so last year, free cash was certified at 1.8 million, which is a decrease of about $250,000 from the year prior. Again, not unexpected. Tom, to your point, you look at 16, 17, 18, and 19 on all of these graphs, and they share something similar. Some of it is good, some of it is a challenge. But this forces us to be increasingly conservative when we already, frankly, are on our aspirations for operating and for capital investment levels, which are by any standard challenged. I did not this year have the community comparison report, the financial condition report leading up to this, because we're working with budget subcommittee and we're going to try to synthesize all that into a more kind of straightforward and helpful and probably less dreadfully boring for everyone else's sake but mine format. But none of those fundamentals have changed, and we've done these reports over and over. Outside bodies have done these reports. our spending, when you try to look at it in a remotely scientific manner of like per capita standards, per pupil standards, road mile standards, is our spending is low. It is low in a total operating budget perspective. It is low in a per capita perspective. And we just simply have revenue challenges.
I think that's a great point, Connor. And while I won't list all of the examples, I think you alluded to it. If we reflect back on a lot of these slides, all of them to me seem to be on the margins, getting tighter or more challenged or giving less benefit, whether it's free cash certifications slightly going down successive years, whether it's the road miles slightly getting challenged over time, whether it's the expense structure slightly being more challenged, or there's a theme that if you look at a lot of these slides, you start to see the trends becoming more challenging across the board. And I know it's nothing quote unquote new, but when you continue to see another year added, like in this, where the amount of free cash certification goes down, what does the next year look like after that? What is, if the
Less,
trend
probably.
continues, right?
Right.
And I think that's just reflective of us, again, being challenged on the expense side. So we're trying to sharpen pencils as best as possible, and each year to be as accurate as possible. And that leaves a little less free cash available as we try to nibble around the margins.
Right. So expenses at this point are preliminary. The town has been successful. We've been, I think, trying to do a full court press for a long time now, pushing on new growth and local receipts on the revenue side, as well as through advocacy on the state revenue portion. But we also don't just take for a given that we don't have control over expenses. We do to certain extents, and in the places that we do, we've been achieving efficiencies there, some of which we're going to talk about on the next item with energy. But we've been very successful in realizing actual cost reductions. So there's a difference between being more efficient and less growth and actually just cutting spending. We've been able to do both in health insurance. We've been very aggressive and successful with energy. We've been maxed out on our net metering cap for years here, where we take advantage of solar credits to offset our energy expenses, which reduces the cost of running the town. We have reorganized departments. Health and Community Services is always kind of a poster child for this, where they've effectively had a net zero cost increase since, I think, 2015. And we just got done earlier talking about the extraordinary additional things that they're doing with less. And again, I would challenge folks to find something in the private sector or somewhere else that in 5 years with inflation where it's been has cost nothing of increased value and is improving programming. It's incredibly rare, and it's a testament to the work of a lot of our departments. We're going to be looking at regionalization. Fiscal 21 is going to see the regionalization of dispatch and the dissolution of an entire municipal department. That's quite a dramatic step, and that's where we're moving. We've adopted wage scales and compensation plans that are more responsible as far as the programmed and built-in salary increases that are more sustainable. And we've also had our employees work with us on the other side of the labor management table in this 3-year window to agree to contracts that are significantly more conservative than in prior years, with 7 out of 8 of them are ratified right now, and I think 5 out of 7 of them took a 0 base wage increase in whole or part for fiscal 19, and that saves compounding interest forever. So they've been working with us there too. Despite those successes, the challenges persist, and our total expenses continue to just rise at a rate that outpaces revenue growth, and that's not a really hard bar to meet because our revenue growth is, outside of taxation and new growth, quite limited and constrained. So where we stand right now is fiscal 21 funds no service improvements for anything in town. The school 4% is just a placeholder while they work through their preliminary requests. I'm sure that you'll be in a level service or regressive situation for the schools, but they are going to work through that and give us a lot more detail as we move into March for the budget hearings. Many needs, particularly for larger departments. DPW we heard about on the capital front. Fire, police have and are going to continue to remain unfunded, not because they lack warrant, but simply the revenue is not there. And those departments, as is our tradition at this point, are going to get into significantly more detail at the joint budget hearings with the Select Board and Finance Committee, which we're scheduling for the Select Board's regular March 23rd meeting on the Wednesday immediately thereafter that. So right now we're looking at town department increases, which are largely contractual, of 3.8%. That's a $662,000 increase to put the total town operation budgets at about $18,096,000 for fiscal 21. School budget increase again, that's a placeholder of 4% figure of just under 1.7 million to bring the school operation budget to $44,058,000. They're in their process of aligning their preliminary budget, and they'll keep us closely involved as we always work together there. So the funds available that we have for appropriation are limited mostly by fixed cost increases. Fixed costs are costs which are difficult or impossible to significantly constrain in a given year. They contain things such as debt service payments, employee insurance premiums, property casualty and liability insurance premiums, and regional assessments for things like regional school and for charter school assessments. So there's a selection of those costs on the slide above. They're preliminary, they will be revised. So debt service on the whole is an increase of $110,000. That's actually, it reflects a decrease in non-exempt debt in the amount of $118,000, but that gets offset by an increase in exempt debt of $230,000, which is primarily due to the beginning of onboarding the short-term interest costs for the borrowing for the early elementary school project. Obviously, revenue will increase outside the levy for that $230,000 amount of exempt debt, and the non-exempt debt is decreasing. But in the net, you get about a 2.5% increase for debt service. I'm going to talk more about employee insurance on the next slide, so I'm going to skip that for now. Workers' comp, property casualty and liability, we're currently carrying a 2.6% increase based on, I believe, our actuals, which is quite advantageous. We've seen that go up significantly more in previous years, so that is a more modest increase. Right now, we're carrying a $100,000 assumed snow and ice deficit in the budget. Our spending is tracking low currently. I've probably just jinxed ourselves, and you can all yell at me in March if I did. But obviously, there's plenty of winter left, and we'll keep our eyes on that. That would be great if we meet the budget and can pull that $100,000 out of the deficit that we're projecting.
How much was that? Out of the deficit, 100,000?
Yes, right now we're assuming a $100,000 deficit there, so that's about 8 or 9% of our total projected deficit. So obviously, we would welcome the ability to pull that out of there. Retirement and pension assessment. So that's a huge portion of our budget. If you think about our budget as just shy of 90 million, I mean, you're looking at more than 5% of our annual spend is being paid to Bristol County Retirement. And that's because, like us, they have ambitious goals of fully funding certain liabilities, and they're working towards fully funding their liabilities, I think, by 2028. And between now and then, their assessments, which basically add on top of employee paycheck contributions that go there, are going to get more and more aggressive until they reach fully funding. In theory, will then drop off precipitously. I don't know how many of us will be at the table in 2028.
Who's going to be around in 2028?
Hopefully me.
I'm shooting for it.
But that should give us a real meaningful opportunity there with millions of expenses coming off the books, but it's quite a ways away. So 6.39% increase for now. That's actually less than what we've seen in prior years. We've been closer to 8 or 9% increases. And with everywhere, again, that we do have some control, we try to exert it. That's reflective of an early pay discount we pay up front to get, I think, 90,000 saved, which out of a 290,000 assessments, a decent chunk. So we try to be responsible there and keep that limited to the extent we can. Regional and county school assessment number is carrying a projected increase for the Southeastern Regional School of 7%. They are still, that's a placeholder for now. They're working through their process. This year, we're also moving to Bristol County Agricultural High School. I'm really off my acronym game tonight. Bristol Aggie is being moved out of the other general government spending account, which is in the town's general budget, and we're going to move that into the regional school budget because that, frankly, is a more appropriate place for it, and because we're going to start seeing some increases in that budget over time because that county school recently approved an MSBA project themselves, and that is paid through assessments to the member communities per pupil. Our enrollment there is quite low. I think it is 5.
5 currently, it
Yep.
will be 7 in 2021.
So they're currently projecting between a $5,000 and $7,000 per pupil cost. So you're looking at a low end of $35,000, high end of $49,000 cost there. So we wanted to get that in the appropriate place in the budget before that happens, so we could pay attention to that as it rolls along. So fixed costs are a dry topic amongst a already dry subject of budgeting. However, I thought there was some qualified good news here that's noteworthy and worth sharing. So health insurance is one of municipalities' largest fixed costs. The town, obviously with our revenue constraints, is always looking for ways to save expenses and control long-term growth to reduce the pressure that's put on our already lean operating budgets. And so 5 years ago, we switched to GIC. We saved $335,000 that year. We've also rolled out through my office insurance incentive plans, things that are not mandatory, but just incent employees. The GIC, I think, offers, I don't know, somewhere between a dozen and 17 health plans. Honestly, it's kind of overwhelming. Folks sometimes go with the brand they know. Maybe they pick Tufts, when maybe Unicare would do it for them based on their actual network needs. And so we rolled out incentive programs that we've been doing, I think, every year for 3 or 4 years now, that encourage people, hey, no pressure, but take a look, and if you switch from a costly plan to a more affordable plan, not only do the employees obviously save their proportional share of premiums, we save a proportional share of a premium, and we cut a check to the employees out of those savings as a bonus, and we still net savings. And I think either last year or the year before, we netted a $100,000 savings through those incentive plans, which is meaningful and cost us nothing to roll out. So the result there is that if you look at the annual increase since when we switched, we're looking at about a 1.5% budget increase to health insurance on average every year. And that is, for anyone who has their own insurance through work, that's quite good. That significantly outperforms the market. The Kaiser Family Foundation does an annual survey of employer-provided insurance benefits across the entire United States. I think I linked to it in the memo. It's actually a pretty cool widget for folks who like kind of geeking out on this data. But I ran an export of government employers with 200 plus employees, which is very comparable to the town of Easton, and what their average family insurance premium increases were in the past 5 years, and they average about 5.84% annually, and we're at 1.5%. So we're significantly outperforming the market there. And if our insurance was rising at 5.8% every year, we'd be having way harder conversations, frankly, than anything we've had to talk about now, because this is a budget that's $8 million. So the difference between 1.5 and 5.8 is massive. So that's been a really important success. Again, I told myself I'm not just going to focus on the challenges we have. So I think that's certainly worth noting.
Well, I think this says a lot about our employees too, and our partnership with our employees, because this gives them the tools to make sure they're right-sizing their health care in a way that helps them. And when they do make those changes, for the town and the employee to be sharing in that benefit
Right,
is really very creative. A great way to get people to pay attention to. I mean, back in the day, when I first got married, my husband and I both had health insurance, and it was no big deal if you were overinsured, because you weren't paying for it, your employers were. So, you know, when you have to start paying for it like I do, I look at that stuff a lot more closely now.
It's a good point, and so that's been definitely beneficial. So for now, the GIC is going through their process of rate setting. They gave a preliminary budget forecast of 4 to 7%, which is obviously on the higher end. I believe that's higher than they typically benchmark their own expectations. They don't like to be significantly above, I think, 3.5%. So we plugged in a 5% increase for now, again, to be conservative, and we will keep an eye on that. Rate should be set, I believe, within the next month. So by the time a new budget revision comes out towards late March, we should know a lot more information on that front, and that'll have a meaningful impact either to the positive or the negative on the deficit. So again, in summary, you are looking at a level service, pretty bare bones operating budget, just under 3%, just under a 3% increase in revenue, with a current preliminary expenditure forecast at 4.19%. We have a preliminary deficit of 1.1 million to work through. It's not insignificant, but we are frequently in this position. We've overcome larger deficits before. We will this time. I've already touched on all this. Basically, we're going to keep an eye on all these important areas as they develop, and we're going to continually refine this budget. So in late March, we'll have the departmental budget presentations. We're currently targeting having the budget subcommittee do their kind of state of the town presentation that first night, building on what they started last year. I should be delivering a refined budget change memo at that time. And we're just going to keep working at it as we always do, and trying to put pressure everywhere we can to get it done. So happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Go ahead, Tom.
Connor, I would just say very well done as always to the team as well. Wendy, appreciate all the effort and everybody else that helps. The write-up was informative. I don't think there was anything that was said here that was surprising. Candidly, it is a continuation of the challenges that we faced for several years now. And I just think it's important that, and I appreciate that you began to communicate now, that we use every meeting that we have between now and when we have to finalize to communicate with our community, because I do believe that it will be yet another challenge discussion of trying to pick a lot of worthy spending locations and a lot of worthy expenses we would like to do that we unfortunately will probably be challenged to do so. You know, I certainly would like to see the use of the free cash, instead of it being against operating, to be more of a capital nature, which is an ideal way to leverage when you have found money. It's to take care of those structural things that, if you don't, can lead to exacerbated operating costs, right? If you don't do the capital project, it might lead to increased R&M, for example, and then that puts further strain down the lane. I think it was perfect timing to have this conversation on the heels of what Dave Fields presented, because I think Dave Fields was representative, to your point, of a lot of capital situations the town finds itself in. I know for myself, I made a mental note to try to get a firmer grasp of the rest of those. While I have an understanding, I'd like to, again, as always every year, refresh my thoughts about the other capital needs that are out there.
Sure.
It's a challenge. I think that we, as you laid out, we delicately balance the importance of savings, because we saw what can happen if we have a downturn in circumstances in just 2 short years. And again, may it never be that depth, but that's not what we're planning for. And yet not trying to use free cash for that, and so that we can save, but having these very worthy expense needs. It is almost at times feeling like there is a no full win situation. It is trying to pick lesser of evils at times. I definitely support being smart from that, allocating monies to the stabilization fund to get that to the certain point of the 7 to 10%. As hard as it is to do that, it is certainly prudent and appropriate, and it helps us preserve the long-term integrity of our financial base. And I think that's so important. It is hard to keep that front and center when we have conversations like we did last year, but it is important to do so, because without that financial backing or backstop, so to speak, the situation could have been much more damaging, I think, as illustrated in the last recession, to weather challenges that we face. So look forward for the budget subcommittee engaging meaningfully on this. This is definitely going to go a long way to helping us further those conversations. We look forward to presenting before the joint teams of the Finance Committee and the Select Board. Appreciate your time to do that as well. And there's a lot of work to do, that's for sure, right, at this part of the process. So thank you again to the team for doing what you've done.
Thank you.
Great. Craig, any comments?
I let Tom.
What Tom said?
I let him handle all the financial parts.
I agree with Craig and Tom, but the couple of quick questions. Which is the 10% plateau that you were referring to, Tom? Is that free cash or stabilization?
So, right, it's the Stabilization Fund, I believe.
Both.
Both
the
added
cumulative
together.
balance. So yes, so we want our reserves,
Reserves, yeah.
ideally to be equivalent to 10% of a prior year's spending cost.
Okay.
So reserves for our terms is both your free cash on hand and your stabilization.
And the second question is this on the website already?
It will be tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you.
And will Dave Field's presentation be available as well?
Yes, Dave Field, we have all of our payment management presentations incorporated into his report page.
Excellent.
And Dave and all the other department heads, it's hard to see on the screen. It's already crossed out. Preliminary capital requests have already begun. So that's an important process. There's a committee for that. Ultimately, they come together with myself and Wendy. We're tentatively, I think, scheduling on March 10th to finalize the prioritization. The capital planning process in Easton, much like the operating budget process, is thorough. It has good bones that it's based off of in our charter and our bylaws, where we talk about you're certainly not making choices about optimization, you're making choices about kind of the least bad things to not fund. Mm-hmm. And the capital bylaw is actually very explicit there, and it's pretty much common sense, but we end up prioritizing life-saving equipment, right? Mm-hmm. Which makes sense. You hate to not fund a technology need. For example, the town has a new version of permitting software we would love to get to, but we need to buy an ambulance, right? And so I don't feel that it's appropriate for me to prioritize or recommend to the capital committee to prioritize software. That's certainly great, helps with new growth when we are going to be challenged on an ambulance, mm-hmm. right? So that is where we are.
It's a tough conversation. It's exactly like this. Again, not equating life-saving to the roads, but yeah, we're taking care of the important feeder roads. We're taking care of the main roads.
That's right. That the most people drive.
Would cost us exponentially more.
And be riskier to public safety.
Right, but we have to, at some point, I think, as a team and as a community, begin to assess what the opportunity cost is of not getting to those other things. It's not that we're making bad decisions on the ambulance, but literally that opportunity cost of not implementing upgrades or keeping our town as relevant as possible to best position ourselves to be successful and support the community. Right. Just long term, I can't help but think those small things add up in aggregate.
Well, I would say another way to say that is measuring our risk, right?
Yeah.
One other specific question to at least address for a moment, Connor, would be the new growth for 21 over 20 is a negative 25%.
Right.
Now, but that's a moving target, isn't it? Because you're getting less new growth to help pay for the expenses that we have, but the new growth itself creates further expenses. Is that?
It's a really complex circumstance. The short answer is not necessarily. Not all growth is the same, right? New growth. So a couple of things. One is the cut we're projecting there is a conservative estimate, which I think is actually the estimate we have gone with every year, including these years.
At least
Right. So we start the budget at the $700,000 assumption every year. It's a safe and conservative number, and that way, if we come in at say 1 million or 865,000 or 950,000, that's a good situation. We then have some additional revenue. We used some of that this fall to offset these additional cuts to state revenue that you might recall came after the budget was balanced. Right. So it's a good thing that new growth came in $250,000 above what we had budgeted, because even after we balanced the budget, then we got hit with another revision to state aid that dropped our state revenue more. So that gives us an ability to kind of tap into things and correct those things at town meeting, which we did in the fall. As far as does the new growth equate to a dollar for dollar offset? my professional opinion is no, you can't make it that simple. The things that drive costs are fixed costs. They are labor contracts, they are broader economic costs, and of course there's a service demand depending on what type of project contributes to growth. But you can't even say what type of project, because if you talk about housing, well, it depends on who moves into the house, right? Who knows? I mean, you could have a relatively low impact from a financial perspective, family move in, or you could have a high impact one. You could have a type of housing that has no children in the schools but has higher ambulance needs. You could have a restaurant that has major issues of abortive health, perhaps. So there's no kind of rubric for if X project, then Y cost. So for really large ones, we usually do a detailed financial impact analysis like we did for Avalon to kind of get at those things more specifically. But no, I think particularly when you're coming from a basis where you are already behind, right? So even if, let's assume that no increased demand for service ever happened ever again, we're still behind on funding levels. We don't have enough to meet the existing need, so not growing is not an option in my professional calculation.
Well, and the other thing is sometimes those drive other opportunity costs. For instance, selecting housing in a certain area drives economic development opportunity
That's
costs.
right.
So that it's just the way that they're planned and rolled out together
Yeah,
make a big difference.
and it certainly has been a blessing at times.
I've never seen a dollar of new growth I didn't like. Just gonna put that out
I'm
there.
gonna put that on a T-shirt.
That's fine.
Good
You know,
one.
I think fundamentally, if you cut out, because we now know you could take the prior 10 years and say you could plug about 300,000 less a year in for the past 3 years and ask yourself, beyond all the ethical implications, beyond the diversification of housing implications, our budget wouldn't have just come into balance had none of those things happened, right? If we traded the growth and the theoretical offset in service demand, we'd still have a structural revenue deficit because it is in my opinion, and my relatively informed opinion, it has been and will continue to be a fundamental revenue problem that if you lay those graphs on top of each other, they basically are mirror images, and that's what we're looking at. But there, of course, are increased demands for services. Chief Partridge speaks very well to that frequently about ambulances. That also brings more ambulance revenue. The types of services people need change, the acuity of those needs might change, but the way that our finances are structured have not fundamentally changed since Prop 2.5 was enacted, minus our second largest revenue source continuing to be more and more inadequate. And in my opinion, that's what's driving the challenge here.
Thank you.